All right, everybody, welcome. Thanks for being here in such large numbers. My name is Tim Lansendorfer. I have the honor of hosting this series on the public humanities this summer semester. And it's my great pleasure to start this session, the last session in this three-session series, with two public philosophers by the names of Thomas Arnold and Florian Arnold of the Universities of Heidelberg and I forgot, sorry, some design place in Stuttgart, which name is too long for me to remember offhand. Apologies, I'll do it afterwards. I want to start this by saying a couple of brief words on the series itself, and then I want to start off our discussion with a question. Because, as you see, today I'm sitting down. Last couple of times I was standing up because I was moderating presentations. Now what we're doing is we're doing a talk. And it's very, very nice to end this on a talk, on a discussion, because we've already had two sessions on the public humanities in this series, sessions which have included discussions of the public literary studies and public musicology. And both of these presentations have already opened a lot of perspectives, I think, to all of the people who were there on the question of what the public humanities can do. We're now segueing not just to a other different field in the humanities, namely philosophy, with its own attendant opportunities and problems, shall we say, but we're also segueing to this open discussion format. We will hopefully have time to chat with one another about what it is that you do when you do public philosophy and how you do it and why you should be doing it. And I'm very excited to have both of these people here, Thomas Arnold and Florian Arnold, already host a podcast on the public philosophy. So by all means, check that out. And I will just start this discussion, as we said, right, with the open question that is set out as the title for this talk, which is, folks, what is public philosophy?
If I may, I'll start as the younger one. Well, thank you for hosting us. Thank you for having us. Yeah, I'll just give a few thoughts on this, and then we're going to start discussing it. So, I mean, the philosophical answer to your question is it depends, because it depends on what you take philosophy to be, and it depends on what you take the public to be. So we'll have to get into some meta-philosophy already at this point. So very briefly, there's a discussion going on, and there's always a discussion going on, what philosophy actually is. Discussing this and kind of finding out what it is always part of the course for philosophy. Although it appears sometimes that people know what philosophy is, it's usually in flow. So we have very different approaches to what philosophy is. It can be taken as theory building, so pretty much like any other academic discipline, almost maths-like, or where it tries to assimilate itself to the natural sciences. It appears to be basically theory building. And you get theories in the philosophy of mind and theories in epistemology and all that. And a public philosophy in this vein would just mean to communicate results. And that is one way of looking at public philosophy. And that's one way of doing public philosophy is basically just science communication or academic communication, where you try to educate the public as to what the newest theory is. Just like in physics, we try to kind of reduce everything a little bit so the ordinary lay person will understand it. And the same thing is being done in philosophy as well. That's not necessarily what we think public philosophy is. I mean, another take would be to utterly disregard any theory building in philosophy and take philosophy to be something therapeutic. The later Wittgenstein, for example, would say things like this. We don't have any theories, and it's just about the destruction or the deconstruction of misguided ideologies and that kind of thing. So it's not anything that gives any results that you could publicize, but it's just an activity that you can do in private or in universities or in public, whatever that means exactly. So there's a whole range of notions of what philosophy is or should be, and depending on your stance, public philosophy will look very, very different from the very kind of academic science communication, result communication, up to engagements, critical engagements in the public, whatever that might be. Generally speaking, public philosophy is just philosophy that is not being done with other philosophers exclusively inside the university. So philosophy in schools, philosophy in cafes, philosophy in jail, as I've done, philosophy in the street, that's all public philosophy. Maybe even podcasting is public philosophy because it's not aimed at an academic audience. So again, it depends. That's my answer.
So maybe I would just add the point that, to stress the point, that it's a quite common practice made explicit in a kind of semi-professional, professional reasoning. So, and I wouldn't call it applicated philosophy or whatever, but it is a kind of enforcement, empowerment of your own thoughts, and the way to get things clear that maybe in normal situations, be a little bit fuzzy or not really at the point. And so I think it's a kind of intervention in the public sphere. And it could be applied to several topics that are currently important for the whole discussion in our societies.
And I think that's important because it brings in the question of topics, because that's one way of defining philosophy as well. So public philosophy could be defined as philosophizing around topics that are of import to the public. And that fits very well with, for example, Dewey's definition of a public as grouped around a problem that concerns a few people rather than just one or two. So if you think of a public as something that kind of builds around problems anyway that need to be solved, then public philosophy as picking up these topics and kind of clarifying them or deepening them or whatever it is that philosophy does, reflecting them, that fits really well. My personal view is also that of an intervention, but also of kind of sparring, really. Because I think philosophy is an activity that you have to train, like an instrument or a sport. Public philosophy is a kind of opportunity, like a gym, where not just professional athletes come and go, but everyone can join. And that picks up on your point of empowerment. It's something you can learn, and that's something we can offer as professional philosophers. So that will be another way of looking at that kind of activity. And then, of course, the medium isn't as important. I mean, it's always best to have a kind of engagement. Again, like with sports, if you just watch people doing it, you're not getting trained. You might learn something, but it's not the same as actually mucking in and trying it yourself. So I think the idea of training is quite important as well, or participation in a broader sense.
I find that very fascinating. And I will say, so here's the format for those of you who are not aware of what the format is going to be, and I didn't probably spell it out well enough. We will be having a sort of internal discussion for a little while, because we have prepared, as it were, a little bit sort of the questions that might go a ways to elaborating on what is public philosophy, but you are the audience, by all means, enjoined to join into this discussion as well. So ideally, what I would say is, for now, you might maybe put your questions in the chat or your comments in the chat so we can sort of organize them for now, but we will go to a regular Q&A or open discussion later on. What I would like to ask you has to do with precisely this question of the public, which is very interesting to me, because one of the things that one of our previous speakers had discussed, Sarah Dillon, was that it's important to have a sense of what public you are addressing in the first place, right? What you consider the public you're talking to. And one of the things that she's doing in her work is explicitly addressing a public of officials, as it were, right? So the institutional system, which actually makes political decision in everyday sort of decision-making processes, right? This is the public that she's addressing. And now we've heard a couple of other sort of related things, right? Dewey's version of the public, the notion of the public sphere, which may or may not be Habermasian sort of open society, kind of bourgeois space in which engagement happens. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what kinds of public you think are amenable to what kind of philosophical discussion, if you like.
Yeah, according to the tradition, old white male persons. No, but yeah, as Thomas already mentioned, it's about to open the discussion to all who participate in our society, all the stakeholders, so to speak, that which are engaged in I don't know, policy questions, in ecologically developments, etc. Yeah. So and yeah, the contribution that public philosophy could deliver would be to get a real talk going on, not only to have a kind of ideologized fight between standable, unstandable positions, but to get some reasoning in it in the literal sense. So to take it to this way, yeah.
Yeah, and again, I think it depends. I mean, what we're doing with the podcast is just broadcasting. We don't really have a public in mind. It has evolved in some sense. You know, few people like to listen to us, and you know that's just how publics work. I mean, they're constituted in some way or the other, and of course, there's a natural filter in what we do because we don't hold back. We don't speak explicitly for a lay audience in the podcast, for example. So it's a kind of indefinite but still filtered audience. But as I said, I mean, I went to jail, which is not, in a sense, a very public space. So it's not public philosophy. I mean, anyone can go to jail if they try hard enough, but it's not open to the public in a sense. But you know, you don't get old white males in a youth detention center, per definition, apart from the guards who also like to listen and engage once in a while. But you know, the public there is very different from, I don't know, when I speak to or with Dutch CEOs and the European Leadership Program, which I've also cooperated with. So I don't think I don't think you can generalize. I mean, it depends. I think philosophy always has to react in a certain way. It's not that we fall out of bed and start asking what is virtue randomly, but it's mostly about well, sometimes we might, but if you look at the history of philosophy, it's mostly people reacting to one another. Sometimes to other philosophers. Obviously, you get the tradition, and then it's not very. I mean, in a sense, that's public, but it's not very general. But you also get engagements with topics that obviously are important to the public and that are already being discussed in public. I mean, Plato's dialogues are a very good example of that, because the Athenians were concerned with how to raise children properly, and the aim of that was called virtue. So there was already a discussion going in which Plato intervened and reacted to. So in a sense, I think public philosophy has to make an offer and then see who kind of takes that up, or it has to look for the discussion, has to look for topics, has to look for groups, has to look for audiences already constituted. I mean, if you look at the approach through the philosophy and series, so Lord of the Rings and philosophy, Star Wars and philosophy, there are the books like that that are in a way public philosophy, which work through engaging with an already constituted audience which is not necessarily interested in philosophy, but interested in something else, and then you try to get them to philosophize through that established topic. And that's a very different way of going to jail, where they can't escape. They have to do philosophy for 3 to 4 hours or stay silent. So that's a very different approach. So I don't think you can generalize very much.
Or you have rather to do it, because there is no special expertise in philosophy except professional reasoning, so to speak. So, but what does this mean? So it's not this special topic you try to explain to a public.
No, it's a skill mostly, I think, that you employ.
So you get into a topic hopping, so to speak. But it's part of this discipline, when you call it like that. That it's a general approach to problems that evolve in different contexts. And so you can you get engaged, but you get engaged as a person, so not really as an expert, kind of expert for this or that. So, and I think this is one of the aims of public philosophy, to develop the personal profile, or what I don't know, the idea of education. You already mentioned the paideia concept of democracy, and it seems to be quite important in our days, to in the sense of radical democracy, for example. It would be the skill to elaborate on your own viewpoint, but also on your own desires, on your own interests, etc. That's not so easy, because there are quite some discourse going on that are just I would call it ideologized by
I mean, that's how I came to do public philosophy in the first place, is that I felt that most public discourses are subpar, logically speaking, to be very careful. Like, a lot of fallacies are being thrown around all the time, and people don't seem to care much, don't seem to notice, and then even if they do, don't care. And I think that's a matter of a lack of training, really, because no one does it. In school, you might be lucky, and some teachers might be philosophically interested, but in general, there's no real training in these things going on. So fallacy detection, both in yourself and others, and you get these talk shows, and it's all rather bleak. And I thought, that's a responsibility we have as humanities professionals, and even in a broader sense, not just philosophy, that we should, and that might sound a bit arrogant, but we should engage in public discourse in order to make it less logically bad, really, and enable, as you say, enable people to see where fallacious reasoning is going on, and maybe develop their own standpoint away from ideology, away from dogmatic positions. So I just started looking for people interested in that, in whatever way possible.
There's a lot of things that I have sort of to follow on from that, and I'll just briefly nod towards them to see if we can get back to them before I ask sort of a more straightforward question, because it seems to me there are a lot of questions involved in this that have to do with issues such as the question of what the profession is, right, as an actual thing that people get paid to do, and how you actually derive your sense of professionalism from what may then become a boundary or barrier to your public speaking about things, right? Because you want to sort of invest yourself in more than just it's a way of thinking, right? Because then you go and say, well, everybody can do that. So you do have this sense of, hey, what is the professional notion of this, and how do I not sort of lose this professional position that I've adopted, right? And this is also a question of what kinds of things does philosophy do that seems amenable to this. And the reason I'm thinking about that is when you get sort of your secondhand philosophy work will tend to nutshell contemporary philosophy into an analytical and a continental school, where like the analytical people are the ones who actually have like tools and things and numbers, and they can diagram logic for you, and that'll also sort of give you an outcome that's actually true. And then you have the continental people who just like to talk, and just sort of that's not. So there's this sense of professionalism as a shield, if you will, for a discipline to say, hey, we actually are doing a thing that is radically different from what everybody else. I'll just back at this because I want to move to sort of the question that I have about this, which is, I said already, we talked about this before, right? And I already said I really like the sort of almost utopian idea that you can make people be better thinkers just by showing them how good thinking works. One of the things that I have sort of penciled in for my work on public literacy studies was to say, I also want to do that. And my explicit sort of claim to why I should be doing it is that literature just doesn't matter. Like we can have really great and controversial discussions about Moby Dick because Moby Dick doesn't matter. Like literally nobody cares. So we can do that, right? And we can really sort of strive to become good debaters on the basis of Moby Dick. And I wonder sort of how that works with philosophy when so much of philosophy is about concrete real world problems, right, that people actually have and that they might actually be really invested in and might not be as willing to just sort of take a step back, right? Sort of when you have ethics as a topic, how do you see this working as a sort of, hey, let's take a step back from your position, right? How difficult is that job?
That is very difficult, but I think that's the main point. I mean, one way of describing this is bracketing things, like in a phenomenological tradition, or taking a step back, and all these metaphors just serve to highlight that philosophy does not work on the same level as the discussion it philosophizes about, and that's very, very hard to do. I mean, even in a professional context at university, you always have to maneuver students from simply assuming that their notions and their usage of terms is the only possible one away towards the possibility that different people can mean different things. And that's the first step that you have to take, is that you have to step back from your own usage of terms and see whether you're actually talking about the same thing. Because you can be talking about the same thing using different terms, but you can be also talking about different things using the same terms. I mean, when you, for example, when students encounter Plato, and Plato speaks about ideas, they will immediately go and say, yeah, I have an idea as well, but that's not what Plato is talking about. So even like in a professional context, not just the public context, that's a very hard thing to do, but it's the first step that you have to take. I mean, in jail, for example, I got into a very heated debate on homosexuality, which is a very hot topic in a boys' penitentiary. And, they always immediately assumed it's something evil. And then, I had to, instead of just saying, no, it's obviously not, I had to engage with them reflectively, asking, well, why do you think that? What do you think is evil about it? Where does that come from? Why is that true? So kind of not engaging directly, but asking these reflective questions is one possible route to that. And in that particular case, it was so emotional, and they were so existentially invested in not being gay, basically, that was almost impossible to do. But I took my time, and I tried to highlight that that's the discussion you need to be having philosophically, not yes or no, but what are we talking about, and why should we believe what we believe about these things? So yes, the existential relevancy of many of these problems is both a boon and a curse, because you can get people to engage very quickly in ethical questions or even epistemological questions, but it's very hard to kind of to get them to do it philosophically, in my experience.
And that seems to me to be an important point. I think it's a deadlock to claim exclusive content in philosophy. So, okay, there are some crazy guys talking about the special kind of transcendence and I don't know, philosophical concept of God or whatever. And then you may get some philosophical insights that, blow you away. But normally it's a discussion about ethical topics or even this quite essential sexuality topics or issues even, that are confronted in these discussions. And but then you get into something that is not really comparable to something like therapy or so. I wouldn't say that this is the proper philosophical approach to these topics, because otherwise I would just advise to spend a visit to a psychoanalyst or whatever. But it's more that you maybe train, but also your skills, your own reflection to observe your own thinking, and to put the right questions. Not providing answers ad hoc, but to put the right questions to get really involved with these topics.
Yes.
To get really involved with something is not so easy. It's not that you I don't know, that you're frightened by something or you really you're completely happy or whatever. Then you get lost in feelings or whatever. That's not something totally bad. It's clear, but to really speaking to the point. Means to get some reflective distance into the speech and the discussion and the topic.
And I think that's where the professionalism comes in as well, because all these theories and these books we've read and the papers we've written and all that, what they give us is, hopefully a whole bunch of, call it tools, but it's just basically concepts and distinctions. So it's the ability or maybe the capacity to distinguish or to try to distinguish important bits, so to find differences that make a difference in certain topics, or to have an understanding of where discussion can lead. So for example, when you come across someone who says things like every truth is subjective, which is important existentially, because when you go to Instagram and you see these normative things where you think everyone should be like this, and that's the objective truth or objective beauty, and then you have to defend against that. You might come up with the idea truth is subjective. And as a philosopher who's done a bit of truth theory, I was come across all these debates about what truth is. That the discussion might go this way or that way. So you might know, or you might have an inkling of the possible distinctions that you can make. For example, truth is subjective, truth is objective, and then you can go on distinguishing, and you have an inkling or an idea of the paths that reflection can take, and you can lead people along them more effectively than when they have to figure it out all by themselves. But of course, you want them to figure out the things out themselves, which means that you have to ask certain questions, or maybe provoke them. I mean, provocation is a totally valid philosophical tool, I think. One I don't use as much as I think I should. But so that's where the professionalism comes in, that we know the conceptual frameworks behind it. We know the nooks and crannies of the notional space, at least to a certain degree. So, we don't need to bring in Plato, Aristotle, or whatever by name, but when we read these people, we learn some of the moves, which we can then employ in these kind of reflexive, reactive, exploratory, empowering training sessions, or whatever they are.
I can think we can open this with Christian Toro. You have a question? Yeah.
I'm sorry if I kind of step in at this point, but if I'm starting to move around, I can't put any questions anymore. I would like to ask how I tried to answer the question, what is public musicology, last Wednesday, and I took a quite different approach. And for musicology, it's very important, or if you mediate or talk about music, the term of appreciation is very important. And I try to compare the German concepts to the English concepts. And we have no concept of öffentliche Philosophie or öffentliche Musikwissenschaft. It's all under this umbrella term Wissenschaftskommunikation in Germany. And this would, would lead into another direction. So my question is, how important for you is the what is normally termed with Wissenschaftskommunikation, that you communicate by interaction, by discussion, what is new in your field? And this is a thing you did not mention yet, because we are in a field where we could also say, okay, that's philosophical pedagogy or didactics or training. But Wissenschaftskommunikation is very often understood as communicating what is new in the field.
Yes, and I think that's just, if I'm being radical, I don't think that's applicable in philosophy, and in the sense that there are no new results. I mean, there's new paths of thought, where someone might offer you a distinction or a perspective or an argument that you haven't heard before, but that's not radically different from employing Platonic moves. So that's one thing. For example, people like Timothy Williamson, who's a famous analytic philosopher, think public philosophy should be, it should communicate results, but that presupposes that you have new results or results at all in philosophy. So and if you know what these results look like, you'll start wondering who wants to hear them, because the newest move in discussing counterfactual logics of a non-standard, non-classical kind is probably of no interest to anyone outside the very, very small group of people who deal with this professionally. So the ideas around, I just don't think it's very valuable, to be honest, and quite fraught, because the question is philosophy a discipline? I mean, sociologically speaking, it is a discipline, because it's in university and we do papers, we do talks, and all that. So it looks like a discipline, but at heart, it might not be. And I think what can be called progress in philosophy is more like coloring in or sketching in a map, a logical map. So you start with one notion or one thesis about a certain topic or a thought that you have, and then you see how far you can go before running into trouble. And we've been doing that for 2,500 years. So there are new pathways, but I don't think they're very interesting to the general public, who don't really understand the path we've been going. So you actually need to communicate the basic problems, the basic moves, how to read philosophical texts before you can engage with the kind of finer points of things.
Just to add, so there is this idea in philosophy since the beginning. There is something like eternal truth. So I'm not really into it. So, but the idea is that when we talk about philosophy or philosophical insights, even I think the first was, or Plato, of course, always the first, but then Aristotle just mentioned, okay, there are different fields of knowledge, and so sometimes they are very contingent. So it's for example in the political field, but there are also inside, like in mathematics or so, that claim so eternal truth. So I don't want to talk about eternity right now, okay, or eternal, but just to mention that there you can see how it is a kind of meta perspective on our thinking, and it's kind of mapping the reflective development we've gone through since 2,500 years. And so it's So yeah, there's no big wondering that yeah, you run into the same questions asked, and so you can really say, okay, Descartes is outdated or so. In one sense, maybe so, but sometimes there are philosophical revolutions that just go back to these positions to see that something was hiding in it, that was overseen by the upcoming philosophy of, I don't know, 200, 500 years or something. And the interesting part on this is that you can really go back to this position without really yeah, losing touch with your own present. If you presuppose that you are not really just interested in antiquities or whatever, yeah, so that you're really into it and you have a existential approach to it. So it's like a big fundus of thoughts, of ideas, and yeah, to get some orientation means to having debates with with yeah, the tradition. So I won't do the joke again.
I'd like to add a point. I mean, you talking. I mean, I always like to talk about Plato. He's the absolute best. But you mentioning both Plato and logic, I think, is an important point, because what do I want to do with public philosophy? And I've mentioned that I found public discourse to be somewhat lacking, dialectically speaking, and the same seems to be true of Plato's times. So the problems remain very similar, and I don't really need people to understand like the newest development in many-valued logics, but I need them to stop being dogmatic, or understanding why dogmatism is a problem, or noticing their own dogmatism, or noticing contradictions, or understanding why contradictions are bad, or why they might be problematic. And that's the same problem that Plato seems to have had, or that was around in Plato's time. So I think that's these basic issues that we come back to are related to the fact that we as humans state things and want others to believe us, and ourselves believe stuff. And I think it's more important to get more people to understand the basics of the logic, not formal logic. I mean, I don't need everyone to be drawing, you know, these trees and doing symbols and stuff. I love teaching formal logic. I've taught a course on introductory course on formal logic. It's always fun, but it's not necessarily what I want the general public to do more of. But kind of the basic logic of argument seems to be important, because that's what matters. I mean, if you debate with people, even if you talk with people, it gets very hard when they're being dogmatic and not even understanding that they're being dogmatic. And these things, I think, matter more than more than the new results, although they do exist. And I mean, sometimes people do ask specifically for that. I mean, you might be asked to elaborate on some finding, or you might be asked to elaborate on the newest philosophy of virtuality or computer games, or whatever it is. So it can be very recent, but it should always, in my view, come back to the basic ability to reflect on topics.
Max, I'll call on you in a second. The one thing that I still have, because it fits right into the question, I think, anyway, that Christian Tore asked, although it goes a little bit on a tangent, and I hope appropriate tangent, especially in the German context, because one of the things that strikes me about this, right, is that we do have a set. No, let's start the other way around. The notion of public, right, sometimes gets sort of in the public understanding lumped together with something like a public intellectual. And we really don't have a lot of public intellectuals these days. Those who are public intellectuals very frequently are identified as philosophers, right? So Jürgen Habermas is still around. He doesn't appear in TV shows a whole lot, but at least so he's the last great public intellectual, if you like. There are minor lights who dabble in philosophy in the German context, such as Richard David Precht, for instance, right? There are also interesting sort of larger lights whom I've seen in public venues I mean, bourgeois public venues, but anyway, public venues, right? Such as Marcus Gabriel, for instance, or Peter Singer, or Daniel Dennett, just to rattle a couple of names I've sort of read in the last year. And one of the things that these people seem to be doing is something like the mediation that Christian Thorel was talking about, right? They seem to be talking at people about sort of accepted philosophical truths. And I wonder if you can talk about how that relates to doing public philosophy, because it seems to me from what you said, right, it's almost exactly not that, because it seems to insist too much on, I'm telling you how it is, right? I'm telling you what the Neue Realismus is and how you should see the world.
I mean that's fine if people ask for that. You know, there's nothing wrong with doing that. I just don't think it's that interesting. It's not that interesting to myself. It's certainly something that you can label public philosophy, and you know, if people are interested in new realism, well, I've taught new realism. I don't mind new realism, and when people are interested in that, it's fine. I mean, we do get asked to elaborate on Plato and Hegel and stuff, so why not? You know, recent developments. So there's definitely a possibility of doing public philosophy, but maybe there's a difference between public philosophy and public philosophizing to be made, and I'm more interested in the latter than in the former. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong. I just don't think it's probably not that beneficial, because, you know, telling people what to think is, well,
yeah, it's quite
we've had
important.
that.
Yeah, so but it's kind of public teaching, you know. So there are movements, there are approaches, positions in contemporary philosophy, of course. And yeah, so the audience wants to know what it is about. So why don't listen to a lecture on this topic? So, but is this public philosophy in a proper sense? That's the question for me, because I think yeah, there's it's not, it's a special relationship in public philosophy. So when we now engage in a debate, it's not the normal discussion format when we listen to a talk or so, in the sense of listening to what Marcus Gabriel thinks of Neue Realismus or whatever. It's more that you go there, you listen to it, and then you got some thoughts, and that's it. So maybe you're working on that, whatever. But the proper idea of public philosophy, as Thomas already taught it, but it's not really a teaching, it's more training or whatever, is then really to get involved and engaged with people. And yeah,
and I mean, in a certain sense, we talked about topics before. In a certain sense, Marcus Gabriel and even Precht, they talk to topics that are of some interest to the public. I mean, democracy and values and, you know, education and that kind of thing. So, and in that sense, it certainly is public philosophy, and it's, you know, people view it and you know, seem to enjoy it. So it's definitely
wrong about it. It's
no, exactly. That's what we're saying. It's I think, I mean, if you want to relate the two forms of public philosophy, so talking in public about stuff, or talking to the public about stuff that even might be of interest for the public, as opposed to engaging with the public and kind of training them on and talking to them, basically. If someone teaches you about new results or tells you something about a position, you need tools in order to evaluate whether what they're saying is worth anything. And I think it's very hard to do both at the same time. So you can present a position and you can try to do it in a way, and for example, Plato does that kind of thing, and also show how to deal with it. But that's a very hard thing to do, because on one hand, you're saying, see, this is true, this is my argument. And at the same time, you're trying to show people how to evaluate that. So you have to try to do two things at once. And I think I'm more interested in debating in order to and highlighting stuff, for example, by pointing out, see, now what you did is that, now you reflected on this, now you used the concept that we've introduced earlier, or now you ran into an inconsistency, but maybe we can avoid that kind of thing, which allows people to evaluate new positions on their own, hopefully a little better. I mean, I'm not overly optimistic. I don't think that going to jail a few times will make the world that much better, even dialectically speaking. But it sometimes some people might get a heightened sense of attention for these logical matters, and they might see something that I haven't seen before, rather than just believing a new theory.
Yeah, and this performative aspect is quite a crucial difference to other forms of public history, public science, whatever, because you won't get ordinary people to become a star in physics during one talk. So it's clear. So but it's quite possible, yeah, to get somebody start to think during one session, so to speak. Yeah, that means so you can really, there are some moments where you can really feel it, that something is happening in the head. So there's an initial impulse, and then you could say philosophy is born. So at some point. So that's quite interesting and fascinating at the same time, that you can see to see people think or start to think and get into new dimensions of their own thinking. So, and that's it. I just want to stress this performative aspect, that is quite important, I think, for this idea of public philosophy we are promoting.
I mean, these are the most fun moments, at least the most fun moments I've had. So I'll just give you two examples. In jail, we discussed the so-called Münchhausen trilemma, which is actually even an older Agrippa's form of. It's a skeptical form of argument against a fundamental justification, or Letztbegründung in German. And it says that Letztbegründung is impossible, so no judgment can be justified ultimately or absolutely. That's the idea behind that. And one of the students just, thought a little while and said, but wait, this is an absolute justification for the impossibility of absolute justification. I thought, yeah, that's really clever, and that's just employing reflection, as you should. And I didn't tell them to do that. I just told them that I don't know how we got to this. Epistemology is always quite close in all of these discussions, because you can always ask, how do you know that? And then someone will say, how do you know anything? And then you get into these things. And that was clever. I thought, yes, he understood something, and he did something that was interesting, and he was very chuffed. Was very pleased with himself, and I was very pleased with him. So we were all very pleased. And the other thing in another school in Mannheim, I had discussion on how they knew that 2 + 2 = 4. Someone said, because people have told us. And I said, well, people have told you other things that you didn't believe. And for example, that they're witches, and we don't believe that anymore, do we? And then someone said, yes, we do. Of course they're witches. My mum can read coffee stains. And I was at a loss of what to do. And someone else, because we've been talking about a justification, someone else back in the class said, wait, what's the reason for us to believe that? That's just a claim at this point. You need to, you need to substantiate that. They didn't use those terms, but that's what they did. And I could just sit back and, watch what was going on. And that was something that they told me after they hadn't done before, kind of just going back and forth, evaluating reasons. Someone said, well, it's on the internet. And then someone else said, well, do you believe anything on the internet? No. So these kind of things going on is interesting more than me telling them what to believe.
I will be quiet, but I have things to say if we have time. Yes, Max first, and then Thorsten Schmidt.
So much interesting stuff. Thank you so much. Still, I'm kind of skeptical about a number of issues, and I just want to pitch that out there, and I'm very curious to hear what you think, because like I get the impression, well, first of all, I think there's like a major difference between Jürgen Habermas or Marcus Gabriel on the one hand and Precht on the other. For instance, because I don't think any non-academic has read a single word of Habermas or Gabriel in the last 10 years, whereas right? Like I think Precht has serious bestsellers across demographics in like in Germany at least. And I feel like to an extent, the public, as we've been discussing it, shares at least some significant overlaps with the non-academic, right? Because if we do philosophy without the public prefix before, we usually assume it's in the academy, right? Like it's in the university or something. And if public is the non-academic, then I wonder what this notion of making an offer that Thomas mentioned earlier really means. Like, how does one make philosophy a compelling offer to non-academics? How does one compose a podcast that is at least partially listened to by non-academics? When one practices public philosophy on the street, how does one make sure that the people who pause to participate aren't just academics? Right? I mean, in jail, we kind of skip the issue because the non-academics simply don't get to leave. Or maybe they do, but I'm assuming that their choice would still be affected by the limited number of recreational alternatives. Yeah, I generally feel like to sell something as dense as philosophy to an audience that has Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, even Netflix as alternatives, where to get their attention, you basically have the entire culture industry to compete with. How do you do that? Wouldn't you need to simplify to the extreme? And like my impression is that this ideal of critical thinking as an enabler of democracy and as a countermeasure against populism, etc., is kind of something that requires a lot of time and resources, where I would kind of insist that much of what made all of us here into critical thinkers, if we dare call ourselves that, is that we got to spend years of our lives thinking through these issues, right? Like we had like a lot of resources that were funds that came from wherever and enabled us to do this. And I wonder if the examples of students who understand something when given the time to think about philosophical issues, I wonder if that really makes them critical thinkers after the fact, or if it just proves that if people are offered time to think, they're perfectly capable of doing just that. And if what really, like, if, I mean, this is really devil's advocate right now, by the way, but I wonder if what really is missing are academics to take up the role of the missionary and not rather less working hours, lower rents, more accessible insurance policies, etc. Generally more time to deal with these issues, to actually have less existential anxieties and more time to deal with these profound questions. Yeah.
Sure, if you can make that happen.
Yeah, it's not an either or, of course, right?
No. So if I may, I mean, as I've said, if you go to jail, they have to listen to you. So it really is one way of doing things. I mean, I just wrote to several teachers, and they're quite keen because someone comes and fills a few hours. And for the students is something different. So I agree. I see the problems, but in a way you can work around them if you go to the right places and the right people. And we're doing a public philosophy project in Heidelberg, so properly public, meaning that we'll be standing in the street trying to engage with people. And my first thought was, well, incentivize them. So I said, if they give a good reason, they'll get some gummy bears. I'll just hand out sweets for engagements. Also, I'll try what we'll try to do, and my students will do other things, but I'll try to get people by provoking them, for example, with false alternatives, so science or religion. Vote and give a good reason for your vote, and you get a gummy bear. And that might lead to people, spending a few seconds thinking about these things and then another few seconds of telling me. But of course, you need to incentivize them. So yeah, either you get people who can't run off, or you incentivize them. As someone has said, for most people, philosophy is interstitial. So most people don't really have the time to engage. And I don't think, well, simplification in a sense is needed, because you need one thing or one move or one thought or one thing to highlight that they can take away with, like, see, this is what you can look for. But, and then they might be able to take that away. And that concerns the other thing as well. I think most people understand that contradictions are bad. I mean, if you break a promise, you're contradicting yourself because you said one thing and you're doing another, and people intuitively understand that that's wrong. So what I'm doing, for example, is, or if they say one thing and then say the complete opposite later, you don't know what to believe, and people understand that. And what I do in these seminars is just point that out and give them the name. That's a contradiction, or a performative contradiction. So I'm trying to build on stuff that they already know. And it's not about the vocabulary or anything, but it's about the experience that somehow contradictions are bad. And then just trying to figure out why, I think allows people to understand them better and maybe have an eye for them. But I admit there's some empirical research needed. I'm trying to figure out how to do that, how effective these lessons are, because that's an important question. Like, what do you have to do in order to effectively train people to, for example, see these basic fallacies? And that's an empirical issue that I haven't solved as of yet, but I'm looking around for that.
But I'm not sure if it is really about the impact. Because I don't think maybe it's its name to get a bunch of critical thinkers in a democratic society, and I would say in Frankfurt, okay, it's clear that's the idea, but that's not everything, I guess, because it's hard to tell. But you're right when we talk about political issues. It would be better to go on the streets, but to go on the streets and talk to each other, maybe it's fine, and the one doesn't need to exclude the other, but won't get philosophers in the sense that we at the same time become revolutionaries. So I don't think so. Maybe this is one of the shadows of thinking that you're contemplating, not acting, but okay, it's not such a strict distinction. But to make the point clear, I think it's even worse to really try to instrumentalize thoughts to get activated for some praxis or whatever. So because there's a proper value in really develop your own thinking, and because in the end it's not clear to which conclusion you should come. It's not said that when we do public philosophy we all become Democrats. So why should that be? So it's clear. So we get in touch with plurality, etc. Okay, but just to compare the situation in Athens. So when we talk about academic philosophy, then we have to talk about public philosophy in a pre-academic sense. So because Plato fled into Plato founded the academy because he said, okay, I can't talk to anybody anymore because nobody gets my point. So that's academic philosophy in a traditional way, so to speak. Yeah. But there have to be some safe space to develop thoughts or something. That's not the idea. So that we are not doing a protecticos to get people into the academy. Yeah, it's not the idea. But to open up the discussion in the sense that we engage in this capacity everybody has. So and then that's the first step. And
I mean,
yeah.
Daniel Zorn, for example, has argued that democracy is the most logical thing to have. So I think there's even about that, there's a debate going whether engaging in that kind of public philosophy might not actually lead to people being more democratic. But I can see,
sorry,
yeah,
sorry, Thomas, sorry, at this point, just to disagree. At this point, then we have to talk about democracy. So there are different types of democracy.
Yeah, let's not.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, even that can be debated one way or the other. There's debate whether philosophy leads to democracy, and I think most philosophers in history would say not really. But you can argue for that. And just wanted to mention Daniel, who's also engaged in a kind of public philosophy and has written on it, and he would say that that democracy is the most logical form of a certain kind of democracy. But that's a whole different debate, I guess.
I'll just use the moderator's pulpit to make two sort of very small points and then call on Thorsten Schmidt to ask or say his thing. The first thing that sprung to mind when you talk about getting on the street is, I don't know if you remember, but there's the Peanuts cartoon where Lucy sits in the booth with the sign that says the psychiatrist is in. And I was thinking of that just now, where you just sort of, you get a little bit of a loose boarded like booth, and you just sit up on side or on Hauptstraße, and you just see who strolls along and asks for philosophical help or literary studies help.
But even she had to use lemonade.
She did, but she costs like 5 cents. So maybe there is also the matter of like, if it's free, nobody cares, something like that. Yeah, and now as regards sur le pavé, la plage. That seems Thorsten Schmidt's point of view right now. Already at La Plage.
Well, thanks first of all, gentlemen, for sharing with us. There were two things that resonated in particular with me. And the first one was when you were talking about your time in jail, which I presume was not you serving time, but just being of service there. And you made a distinction of speaking to and speaking with. And one could probably assert that public discourse these days is a lot more about speaking to, and essentially it's a shouting match or shouting bout. And how can we use whatever part of the humanities in order to make it an actual interaction, especially at a time when seems like we've lost 20% of the voting public already, and probably even more so.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think the trivial answer is twofold. We can show that talking with each other is more interesting. So it just doing it might show people that it's more interesting to carefully discuss with rather than shout at each other. But of course, I mean, that's always the problem. You can only do that with a very few people, but you can shout at a lot of people. So there's an asymmetry there that won't go away and won't enable us to give a lot of people that kind of feeling. And the other thing is that we might, not just by example, but by empowerment, empower people to see how boring and unproductive these kind of shouting matches are. Because these shouting matches exist because people watch them and kind of seem to enjoy them. And maybe if you train people to recognize how fallacious and stupid they are, they might not enjoy them as much. So these are two things I can think of.
Well, and that straight away leads to the other thought that resonated a lot, which is, yes, we are witnessing politics in particular being turned into spectator sports, and without anyone realizing that in the same way as Waldhof against Lautre, without the teams actually playing with each other on the match, there would nothing there would be no spectacle per se. But I really like this idea of the gym and the sparring beforehand. And as someone who not only practices yoga, but also jiu-jitsu and boxing, I find it insanely interesting, the difference on seeing world-class fighters in the Madison Square Garden and all sorts of feeling as oscillating through me while doing so. But being able and continually training with characters I don't know, where everyone, especially in my weight class, could literally kill each other at any given time. And you can go to any gym in the world and you find the nicest possible people there. And there's so much more respect than I've ever seen in academia when opponents talk to each other. And where it seems like a lot of the differentiation and the one-upmanship seems to be so much more important than in arenas where people actually could die. And what could we do to make this training more appealing overall, outside of lemonade and gummy bears, which obviously goes a long way already?
Yeah, it's about 50%, I think. I mean, academia needs to be more philosophical in that sense. Academia is a lot of shouting at people, so that's not what I want to bring into the public, because, as you've said, there's enough of that there. So sportsmanship in a certain way. Sorry, I don't want to think of philosophy as games. Or as a sport. But that sportsmanship will be important, and thinking of it as a cooperative thing rather than fighting. I mean, even if you do sparring, and even if you do tournaments. I mean, I used to do taekwondo. You still come up to people and say, "Hi, I'm Thomas. How do you do?" And afterwards, you bow, and you have all this formality, and it's an important aspect of it, because, as you said, you can injure people, kill them, and in academia, the viciousness doesn't really have that effect. So yeah, I think that's more a problem of academia rather than philosophy.
So
I don't.
it needs to hurt more, is what you're saying.
Well, I mean, yeah, Florian, you have ideas about this?
The philosophy was a bloody business. Just think about the fate of Socrates. So you can die for philosophy. But yeah, of course, this is only one but crucial example. But I think there's something behind this. It's also it's really hard to tell. So I really have to think about it, because I think it's a central question when we talk about the influence, the impact of public philosophy, and what we really want to get into the people's minds. So it's just to give them some training on logical topics. No, that's not all. Huh? I would say, is it kind of traineeship in democracy would be nice, but I'm not sure. Okay, but what are we after? And maybe there is this. At the end we have to talk about what is a good life to live, and how could this work out together. And one part of it is to find a way to discuss with each other, and that doesn't mean just to make clear what is important for you, but to find out what is really what you want. So that's not clear what you really want, to put it this way. And and then
why I found it particularly interesting. I think you used sparring. You did not use training or doing jumping jacks, but you used sparring, and I found it insanely interesting, because it's really, I mean, in sparring it has to mean something. You're still wearing maybe headgear, but it's the real thing, and yeah, it's getting it out of the ether.
Yeah, but this means when we stick to this paradigm of sparring, then it's clear that that you have to find out who you are, what you can, in despairing. So you confront your limits. You maybe get injured or whatever, but in the end, so there's this term of this phrase by Carl Schmitt. Huh? The other is the own gestalt as a question. So, and it's about you and yourself, because it's not so clear what yourself is when you get into a real discussion. Because when you really want to get into a real discussion, you have to confront the possibility that you lose your own perspective, because the other is right, and then you're wrong, and you have to change something. Or you start shouting. So,
or you start acting like you're playing a card game and you have an ace up your sleeve, and it devolves into that kind of card game, like, but here's my better argument. Well, here's my better argument. And I mean, that can be fun, but it's not as existential as I think philosophy is. And I just wanted to add that what Plato says about philosophy is that it's a synousia, so it's a being together in which something happens. And I think that's the very basic definition of being together, not in an antagonistic way, but in a very different kind of way. So yeah, that's what we practice when we do philosophy. I mean, it might sound a bit romantic, but ideally that's what philosophy is, being together in a certain way. And maybe the sparks fly, or maybe not. It's very hard to plan that, but ideally that's what happens.
But here, an interesting intervention of Max. But sorry, Tim, it's your part.
No, and but because it's written down, I would sort of let Ines say something first, and I'll use my my pulpit again just to say that one of the things that a very good friend of mine has recently said, and I've stolen it. He's a Marxist literary scholar, and he went and was asked sort of like what's the thing that you think you're doing in literary studies, and he said the thing that the best thing I think I can be doing is to make not fascists. Sort of as the minimum goal I have, right, is it's not to make everybody sort of subscribe to Marxism or be socialists or anything like that. If they come out of my classroom, the one thing I want to have achieved is that they are not fascists. And then he's sort of like, that's okay. And that seems to be apropos of the discussion about sort of what is the democratizing value of doing this kind of work, right? So it's just a comment, not a question or anything like that. Ines, sorry.
I think maybe there's also a comment, not a question, I don't know. Maybe just like a little intervention because of confronting the thing, Max, you said about, I wonder if there's a bias if we say like there are like critical thinkers and there are people who have no time. You didn't say they have no time to think, but I was thinking about, I mean, everyone's like thinking. So it's just maybe the thing of opportunity to be vis-a-vis with somebody and to think together. And I think it's also a bit, maybe even dangerous if we conceptualize it this way, and also dangerous if we think too much about this impact stuff. And sorry, Tim, but also this not making fascist, because I think what you said, like this contemplating, not acting thing, I really love this. And I think we're like in doing public humanities, right? We're like brave and going out and trying to do stuff maybe out of an experience we had, which is an experience of, I was fascinated by, I don't know, a text, a person, but a situation where we were thinking and being together, right? And so we should be also brave not to defend, you know, like this very own space and own logic space, even if we try to go viral in public, you know what I mean? I think this is really, really, it's dangerous for humanities scholars who go out not to claim too much that they save the world, because others outside want them to save the world also, you know, and will say, okay, then you can do this, and this is a thing also of instrumentalization then. I don't know if I got my point. Could you understand me? No. A bit.
No, I agree, because when you when take this in comparison with Max's statement that it's a kind of economic talk, the market, etc., then I would just say, yeah, it is, but take the market in this essential function, not in a neoliberal way, but just imagine Socrates standing in the agora, what is just the market and the place where people get together. It's a kind of gathering, and that's not only a pun. It's really about thinking this kind of gathering in another format, another way of getting together. And it's not about trading. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. In this sense, it is not in the sense that it's the mark in the ancient Greece. Yeah, but you see the point. So when you go there, that's the place, the public, where you can get into a discussion, and at the same time where this something could happen. What after Aristotle is called friendship. And for Aristotle, it's clear that there can't be real friendship without a kind of philosophical perspective on your own and the life of the other, your friend, because it's a kind of getting engaged with truth. So that could also happen on the market. So when we're talking about neoliberal markets, we're talking about the opposite. We're talking about to value something like this or that, but just get it sold. Huh? So, and that's something different, and I totally agree at this point. But this is not the job of public philosophy, and so it's clear that when we talk about an offer, it's also an offer in the sense that you try to open towards somebody and to parrhesia, to speak frankly and to be sometimes even harmful in that what you're saying. So just to get into a really close relationship between people, and this normally it's not only a question of bodies, but it's also a question of getting clear what you're after. So, and the other example, so the sparring, it's interesting because this is a very touchy business. And at the same time, it is a very active business, but it also hurts. And I would say nothing can hurt you like really words. So, and no,
I mean, yeah.
So you don't. You see, there's a difference between getting hurt and traumatized by, I don't know, violence, and or to get really ruined by a statement by a person. You're really So it's, I would say it's really hard. So, but it's an interesting topic, so we should discuss it another occasion. But
yeah, I just want to add an example where it talked in a school where it talked about epistemology, and I know the question of how do you know anything, and I didn't tell them like, okay, so here's our analysis of knowledge and these are the criteria for knowledge, but I just kind of engaged in a conversation and they couldn't come up with anything. They didn't manage to find criteria for knowledge, which means that they kind of ended up with a form of skepticism. And you can take that as a kind of play, but there were 9th graders, so not cynical academics, but children. And one of them said, well, you're just taking away all securities right now, and now I don't really know, like, who should I believe? Because now you've told us that, or now we've talked about the fact that people telling us things might not be a good reason to believe them. Surely that's true of teachers as well. So what are we supposed to believe and learn? And that was clearly an existential issue. So I had to engage with that. So I mean that's just that was a brief exchange, and I think I hope I have managed the problem by ameliorating the whole situation with skepticism and all about. That's just one example where I think I got a hint of what philosophy is able of doing in the even in the bad sense.
I'll just also very briefly comment on the question of the ones that Ines and Max raised, because it's one of the questions that I've been engaging with regards to literary studies, which is specifically sort of the question of in how far are we already and necessarily determined by market logic simply for existing within a completely commodified and completely marketified society, right? And for literary studies, I've not come up with a good answer to that, right? I do think that the Marxian adage holds that whilst we're in capitalism, we will be critical critics, and we're sort of have this professional identity that is completely tied to some form of exchange mechanism, right? Whether we give utility to a public through our teaching, for instance, right? Or whether there is at least sort of the belief that it's a valuable service to produce a monograph, say, is sort of besides the point when you realize that it's still sort of determinative of your employment that you are doing that, right? That you are delivering a good of some sort to somebody who hires you. And it's clearly not as terrible in academia as it is in other forms of employment, but it is still this sort of rationale of you have to bring something to the table in order for your job to sort of do something for society. And one of the answers sort of that I have to that is to lean into it, as it were, to say, yeah, that's exactly right. I'm not about to say that we don't have to give rationales. We don't have to say we are not in the market logic, but we should see what kind of rationale would in fact offer the best value to the people that you want to give value to, right? Sort of discover your own employer, as it were, while you can, because you're just paid randomly by taxes, right? If you are. But it also goes to the question of, and it doesn't really go as an answer to the question, but you, Thomas, raised the question of whether or not philosophy is in fact a discipline. And there's a dual answer to that, right? In a way that there maybe isn't for musicology or literary studies, because they're like philosophy is, yes, an academic discipline because you get a job, right? And you have to work in it and you get paid and you retire at some point, ideally. And in that context, you have different sort of conditions to your work, right? You need to do particular things. But philosophy is also, as you have now repeatedly pointed out, right, a praxis, right? A way of engaging, a specific way of thinking through problems, if you like. And in that sense, the public angle seems more curiously divorced than my angle of literary studies is, right? Because my angle is kind of like I'm going out to do what literary studies as a profession does, but literary studies really only exists as a profession. It's almost the only thing that it is, right? There's nothing that you can go and say like private literary studying in the way that you do like philosophize. Right? Maybe, I'm not entirely sure, but right, sort of the market logic thing is not easy to escape, I suppose. Sorry, that's just a comment, and I'll have Thorsten Schmidt ask now.
Well, something that probably draws back a little bit to your experience teaching in that school in Monheim is if in all this discussion about public philosophy or public humanities in a whole, it somehow seems to go hand in hand with the trap of the problem of patronizing people. And how, especially in philosophy, one could easily argue that almost exclusively all of the questions are insanely dear to anyone who's ever sat in a dive bar at 6 a.m. in the morning. And how do we make sure, because last time I checked the news, all these big troves of knowledge siloed up by specialists didn't get us all too far, and we may need solutions coming from other places. And how can we make sure that we include more people in these conversations without fencing and fending them off by nomenclatura and terminologies?
Well, I guess exactly by doing that, just don't use the too much of the old transcendental a priori blah 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 terminology. Something I try to teach my students as well is, I mean, first I have to learn all the terminology, and then I have to unlearn using it all the time, exactly for the for the reason that you exclude people by doing that. So I think that's actually just the first step. Also, if you do really react to stuff, and not in a way of saying, well, here's my take, or here's the truth, or but kind of just asking questions. And this sounds very banal. Don't use too much shop talk, and ask a bunch of properly open questions. That sounds trivial, but I think that changes a conversation radically. Also, of course, you need to get to the dive bars. I mean, that's what we're doing. That's what we're doing with the public philosophy stuff. We're trying to get a bar marketing. We're trying to print Bierdeckel, especially for that, because there's an interesting paper about this. There are philosophical spaces, different philosophical spaces. So it's not just about whom you're addressing, but also where. So yeah, I agree. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in dive bars, or kitchens, and I don't think we should draw that big a distinction between like the seminar and the kitchen and the bar. And
But
the
the
easiest
crucial bit would be, how do we action items after that?
Sorry?
And
Yep.
the crucial bit then, as you said, that's the first step. How do we action items stemming from the dive bar, the kitchen, or the seminar, wherever?
Mm. Well, I mean, yeah, that's something we're thinking about at the moment in the context of this public philosophy event, where we try to create these spaces and kind of thinking about how to incorporate all these things. But yeah, ongoing process, I'd say.
Having a look at the clock, I see that we have about an hour and a half, so we are ready to shut it down, but we don't want to do that before Ines has asked her question, and then we'll just see if this will slowly peter out.
Yes, I think that's great, because then a question has to do like with your podcast format, because maybe one way is also again being brave to just show yourself as humanities scholar and as friends while you're talking to others, right? Because and also being brave to show your like terminology, because I think no, it's not a secret, maybe for people here. My mom is listening to your podcast, and she's a non-academic. But it's about, I mean, you have some titles, and she's I have some experience with death. Oh, I have some experience with, whatever. And then she's listening, and maybe she's just like engaging her thinking with stuff and maybe doing her own ways, she is. But this, I think, also makes an experience to go out and talk with others in the own way one can. So I think we shouldn't be too humble with this method.
Yeah, just to summarize this point on terminology, it's clear that there's something like Arbeit am Begriff, this standing stance of Hegel. And as also Adorno put it, so just to do a little bit name dropping at the end, it's important that we don't try to get rid of all the insights that that charge these concepts with ideas. And it's nothing wrong about it to teach some concepts, and sometimes it's the best word, so it's just matching. And then the job is to make clear what it is about. So, because in the end we won't have people around us that are treated like little childs, and we are all the teachers. The idea is to get them at the point of reflection that they can just join in. So, but that doesn't mean to apply vocabulary. It's clear. So that's the other problem we have in philosophy, especially in academic philosophy, that the problems we are discussing are not really ours, which is a kind of a proliferation of a kind of way or a way of speaking. So, and it's not the idea of philosophy. But public philosophy, I think, tries to be both a kind of an engagement with the public sphere in the sense of public problems of our times, but at the same time to combine it with the kind of insight that not only reacts to what is happening, but tries to reconstruct the discussion, the debate, to give some ideas in that can develop in this every time singular place of a discussion. So maybe the agora or whatever.
Excellent stuff. I think I'll call it a day for here. That seems a perfect way to stop, not just because we will end on Hegel and talking about concepts, which is a thing I've been trying to teach my students like for the past 5 years or so. And I mean, it doesn't really take, but it's an ambition to keep. I'd like to thank the two of you, Thomas Arnold from Heidelberg University and Florian Arnold, whose university I just Googled, and I can now say it's the Staatliche Akademie der Bildenden Künste Stuttgart. Excellent. Long title, lovely place, I'm sure. The podcast is Arnold and Arnold, available on Spotify and all your excellent media outlets for podcasts, I'm sure, although I have not actually checked beyond Spotify. Thanks very much. It was a wonderful discussion. I'm very much looking forward to continuing it at an opportune time. Thanks for taking the time. Thanks for the wonderful input. And thanks to everybody else for being here. And I'll now let you go to the warm summer evening.
Well, thanks for having us, and thank you for the discussion.
Yeah.
Lovely stuff. Thank you, everybody, and take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.